Hello, welcome to the Sci-Fi Christian Book Reviews, brought to you by the Sci-Fi-Christian.com. I am Ben DeBono, coming to you on a very humid Minnesota afternoon, so if you see me sweating profusely during this video, I'm outside, and that's why. Our state motto here is Land of 10,000 Lakes, and during our rather warm summers, warm by Minnesota standards. I mean, for me, anything over about 75 is just unbearable heat-wise. But all of our 10,000 lakes contribute to the enormous humidity that we get to enjoy here during the summer. So it's all good. I'm going to be doing something a little bit different that we haven't done yet on these book reviews, and that's a reread review. I have to enunciate that one. Lots of R sounds. Reread review. So actually for the next 2-3 videos they might be rereads. Not because I've been reading old stuff more than usual. I tend to, when I reread books, either listen to them on audiobook or read them fairly slowly, like just a chapter or two a day at the most. And so they tend to take me a long time to get through. And that's been the case with everything I'm going to be reviewing for you today. It just so happens that I've kind of reached the end of a few rereads all at about the same time, so you guys get to hear a few reread reviews right in a row. So for this first one, we're going to be talking about Game of Thrones, or A Game of Thrones. I should get the initial article in there, since that's been chopped off by the TV series. And at least when we're talking about the book, we should include it. So Book 1 of A Song of Ice and Fire, A Game of Thrones. Just a word about spoilers. I will talk about everything in this first book. I do understand that even though, you know, the TV shows aired, people are at various points. Spoilers are all over the internet, but I will not talk specifically about anything that is in books 2 through 5 at this point. I may refer to things in a thematic sense, but I will not talk about specifics. So you can decide your level of comfort with that regarding your choice to watch this video if you have only read the first book or watched through the first season. But that will be the extent that I cover in specifics. And when I do rereads, what I kind of want to do, rather than kind of treating it like a normal review, I'll kind of give you my thoughts on what I felt about the book the first time I read it, how that compares to how I feel now after the reread. And maybe, I think what I'll usually do is just kind of focus on 1 or 2 elements in the book that really struck me in the reread, rather than trying to give a full overview of everything as I might try and do with a normal review. So for Game of Thrones, I catch myself again there. I obviously love this book. You know, I read it, gosh, over 10 years ago, I think 2002, 2003, something like that, was when I first started the series. There was only 3 books at the time, so I remember just being blown away by it, as so many other people are. All the surprises that so many people have just gotten in the last couple of years. You know, me and several other people got a decade or more ago. The shock of Ned's death at the end of the book, the way that it's structured, the way it compares to, or doesn't compare, as the case may be, your kind of traditional fantasy epic. So obviously, I'm a huge fan. As anybody who knows our channel, has watched any of our videos, realizes Game of Thrones, the TV series, has been one of our biggest successes here at the Sci-Fi Christian in terms of viewership. And for me, I'm a huge book reader. My love of the books came first by a long shot. So love this book. I've reread it, gosh, 3, 4, or 5 times. I don't even know how many times this is for me. Now, many. So I still obviously have loved it every time. I loved it again. A great, great book. I do have to say that, you know, like I said, this is probably I want to say at least read 5. It might be read 6 for me, but at least 5. So after that, many reads after, or listens to, because I've listened to all of the wonderful, wonderful Roy Dotrice audiobooks as well, which if you're curious to kind of experience the series in a slightly different way, I highly, highly recommend them. and then watched season 1 of the TV series twice all the way through. So I'm pretty familiar at this point with what happens in this book. You know, there's always specifics here and there, small details that tend to escape you. As somebody as dense as Martin is, and as clever a writer as he is, there's always things to get that you're not going to catch further times around. And I'm not a theory hound or anything like that, where these people who, you know, will reread the books ultra closely for every last detail. I've never been somebody like that, so there's always some things I'm going to pick up. But, you know, for me, I read this one pretty slow because in terms of tension, suspense, all of that, it's pretty much gone for me at this point. And that's not to say it's not enjoyable. It still is such a great read. But the things, you know, people who read the series for the first time, I gotta know what happens, it's an absolute page turner. Well, you know, not after read 6. But the fact that I'm still interested after 6 reads is a testament to the fact that this series and this book aren't just about the holy crap, what just happened shocks that occur throughout. I think that this story holds up very, very well apart from the shocks, apart from all the twists, and that's what makes it so fascinating to come back to. But what I mainly want to focus on and what really caught me this time around, I want to talk about 2 characters, Ned and Circe, who I really saw in a different light than I had before. Ned especially, for me on this read, I've been doing a lot of thinking lately about different types of characterization, especially in light of Superman just coming out. I've been kind of thinking in terms of the difference between archetypal characters and kind of the morally gray characters that are so in vogue today. And for myself, to continue with the comic book analogy, I've always struggled with Superman as a character, but I've been a huge Batman fan, and as I was sitting watching Man of Steel, it suddenly clicked for me that the reason that I've struggled with Superman is that I was wanting him to be this kind of morally gray character in the way Batman is, this complex character, but really he's an archetypal character. Okay, and once that clicked for me halfway through Man of Steel, all of a sudden the character started to work for me in a way that it hadn't before. And I think, and it's not because I can't enjoy archetypal characters, I didn't like them, I wasn't thinking about them that way. You know, some of the best fantasy sci-fi novels ever written, Lord of the Rings, is full of archetypal characters, and it's a brilliant novel. You just have to accept and realize that's the type of characters you're going into, rather than wanting them to be morally gray characters, and this kind of brooding, complex character that somebody like Batman is. So we have these 2 types of characters that show up often in movies and literature, and that's very much true of Game of Thrones. Pretty much everyone in this series is a morally gray character, and that's part of what's given the work so much praise and so much acclaim. It is the seminal work of postmodern fantasy because of that reason, because it deconstructed the archetypes of classical fantasy into these morally gray, ambiguous areas that hadn't been explored before. And that's a big part of its genius. Except there's one character who doesn't fit that mold, and that's Ned. Ned is very, very much an archetypal character. And I find that fascinating to read Game of Thrones with looking at him not as just another one of the gang, so to speak, but as that archetypal character. He doesn't fit in the world. And to me, that's completely fascinating. And I think that that makes what happens to him in this book that much more profound, not from a story standpoint, not from a shock standpoint, but almost from a literary criticism standpoint. It's as though Martin takes the Aragorn type character, the wise king who would be perfectly at home sitting on the throne at Minas Tirith. I mean, you know, Ned would be great in Middle-earth. That's his world, where there isn't political backstabbing, but the enemies are the guy who, you know, lives on a continent called Mordor, or a country called Mordor, and has Mount Doom right in his backyard, and it doesn't get more obvious than that he's the bad guy. And so Ned would be completely at home in that world. And so Martin takes that type of character, who's a great character, and he puts him in his world. And I think that's very, very deliberate on his part. And then we see that type of character completely confounded at every step because he does the right thing. And that's so key, I think, to what Martin's trying to say through the character of Ned. Ned doesn't fail because he's incompetent. He doesn't fail because he is sinful or corrupted. He fails because he is good and because he is honorable, and that does not work in this world. And all that leads up to his eventual execution, and it's the killing of the morally gray, or the archetypal character. It's the killing of the classical fantasy hero, if you will, is what happens at the end of Game of Thrones. And is it brilliant from a story standpoint? Absolutely. Absolutely. I think that, the scene in episode 7 of season 1 of Game of Thrones, where Littlefinger betrays Ned and the whole thing in the courtroom, that's one of my, in the throne room, that's one of my favorite scenes in the whole series and in the book. It's so well done. So from a story standpoint, that's brilliant. But there's a high level of literary criticism that's taking place as well that's equally brilliant on the part of Martin. He's saying, okay, here's your beloved hero. Here's the guy who has dominated the fantasy scene archetypally for the last 40 years since Tolkien, and I'm going to kill him. And to me, that makes such a strong statement, and that's part of the genius of this work, is that we're going to look at the fantasy genre from a different point of view. We're not going to have your standard Aragorn-type hero. We're going to go somewhere else. And to me, that is an absolute work of genius. And it's that level of literary criticism that I think you only are going to get on a reread once you get past the, oh my gosh, what happens next, or I'm trying to keep all these characters straight. It's only once you've, seen the show enough times or read the books enough times to get past that point where it isn't about I gotta get to the next chapter, or I gotta find out what's gonna happen next, that you can really settle in and realize exactly what Martin is doing in this series from a literary standpoint, and it's brilliant. Okay, so that's Ned. Now let's talk a little bit about Cersei. Cersei, actually, what helped me see her in a different light was the TV series. When I originally read the book, Cersei was like the villain, is how she came across to me. Evil, there's almost nothing redeemable about her. In a sense, I would say I almost read her as the opposite archetype of Ned. If he's the archetypal hero, she's the closest thing to an archetypal Dark Lord that we get. Now that's overstating it a little bit, but you can kind of see maybe what I'm getting at there. Lena Headey, or however you pronounce her name in the series, doesn't play her that way. She plays her much more sympathetically, much more as a tragic figure, as somebody who is caught in these horrible circumstances, caught by love for her son, even though she realizes he's evil, caught in this horrible marriage, and yes, caught by her own wrong choices. And at first in the series, I didn't like that, because that wasn't how I pictured Cersei. But now after 3 seasons, going back and rereading the first book, it's there. That portrayal is there. And it's a fascinating way to look at the character, not as this irredeemable, evil character, but as somebody who is really in a tragic situation. Yes, and again, of her own doing. I think you can blame her for a lot of what she goes through in the series. But I think that again is part of the genius of Martin, is that a character who at first glance is going to appear evil, irredeemable, you can dig deeper into them and see the tragedy underneath all of that. And maybe she is irredeemable. We'll see where her character arc goes. But if she's irredeemable, it's irredeemable not because of her nature, but because of the tragic way that her life has gone. So those are a couple thoughts on Game of Thrones. For you. I'm not going to get that right. We'll see if I can do better for A Clash of Kings when I eventually finish my reread of that one. Obviously a great book. It is the fantasy series of the current generation of fantasy that came out really clumsy. But you know what I'm trying to say. It is. I would resist efforts to say that Martin is the next Tolkien just because they're such different writers, but in terms of a series that has impact, this is obviously comparable in terms of its impact in the genre and on pop culture and culture at large as what Tolkien did with Lord of the Rings. So by all means, if you've only watched the series, go back and read the book. And if you find yourself feeling like, oh, the plot's just the same as in the series, that's okay. Don't let that frustrate you. Maybe that means you read it slower, but stop and look for some of those elements that I pointed out and see if you can notice maybe some of the same character beats or even some other ones about characters I didn't discuss. Absolutely a 5-star book, in my opinion. Love it. Looking forward to rereading A Clash of Kings, so it's certainly going to be a while before I come back, because as I said, when I do rereads, I tend to read pretty slowly, so don't look for that anytime soon, but when I finish it, I will come back and do a reread review of that one as well. But for now, I'm Ben DiBono, and this is the Sci-Fi Christian Book Reviews. Goodbye.